So the first book is probably one I can talk for hours and I just can't recommend enough because, well, at this point I'm convinced that this is simply my favorite book, At the Shrugged. It's kind of hard to recommend because look at this thing, it is a cinder block. If somebody was trying to abduct you, I'm pretty sure you could use this to fend off yourself or any other people for that matter of fact. But it was just kind of amazing that a book this large could actually hold my interest all the way through to the end. Now, there's that famous 70-page speech, which I'm not going to lie, I skimmed over most of that, but other than that, this book is utterly fantastic. Well, the main reason I picked up this book, and this is kind of one of those things I laugh at in a ways, is because I want to say his name is Ken Levine offhand, who made the BioShock series. I heard that he based most of it off of At the Shrugged. However, I've got the BioShock collection here, and in it you can pick up exclusive interviews with the creator, as well as, I think, the lead artist offhand. And he says that he actually got most of BioShock from another book by the same author called The Fountainhead. However, I still got introduced to At the Shrugged, and I'll be pretty thankful for that. So you may be wondering why earlier I kind of kept this version of At the Shrugged away. Or you may be wondering why I have two versions in the first place. Well, the first thing is with this version, on the bookmark itself, I marked off several pages which I thought had some very interesting quotes in there that I later wanted to go back and either tell people or show, stuff like that. This version was to help complete my collection, actually. So, you may notice that the Fountainhead is also by Signet Books, also has the yellow pages, and has a pretty similar typeface. In fact, even the back has a very similar picture of the author herself, as well as the basics. And I love the idea that they have the original price tag on this one. Fascinating thing about this version of the Fountainhead is apparently this picture right here was painted by Ein's partner, I guess would be the best way to explain it. She had some rather interesting ideals about marriage, but it was a man that she was very close with named Frank O'Connor that actually did that picture. And it very well fits if you ever read the book. While At the Shrugged is probably my favorite of the four that she wrote, I feel like The Fountainhead was probably the most thought-provoking piece of literature that I have ever read. Up next we have We the Living. Now, I went into a lot more detail about this when I reviewed it earlier. But as you can see, this one is also by Signet, matching with the other two of the collection I showed you, and also has those blood-drenched pages, just like the James Bond books do. And once again, I just love this cover. There's something about the picture here in the middle, as well as the colors that I like. And it's kind of interesting, because most people that have heard of the author have probably ever heard of Fountainhead or At the Shrugged, so it's like, hey, you know, this is the first book that she wrote. And then the second book she wrote, it's a little different in terms of design. I also did a review on this one, but I was also happy to see that it was still published by Signet, which, surprisingly, they have not changed their logo. So it feels like it's part of the collection. And then the other thing that's part of the collection I have is this one, The Virtues of Selfishness. Eventually, I'm going to get around to reading this, but I guess I like stories, and that's what all the other stuff she wrote was. This was more about selections from her newspaper known as The Egoist, if I remember correctly. But it's also interesting to just kind of have the author talking to you directly, which I find very interesting. However, the main reason I picked it up is if it's a theme, you know, it's Signet, it has the same picture on the back, that kind of stuff. Up next is East of Eden. At this point, I've read a pretty good chunk of Steinbeck's work. So, in school, had the read Of Mice and Men. I also read The Grapes of Wrath, which, while I can see why I won the Nobel Peace Prize, it's just kind of a hard book to recommend. Sometimes there's some very beautiful imagery, and sometimes there's just the underbelly of humanity at that time, and, well, it ends very bitterly, and I was hoping that The Grapes of Wrath would end on a somewhat better note. And this one I just read on my own, The East of Eden. And this one, out of the three that I mentioned, is probably my personal favorite. It's very interesting, as it seems a bit more like a slice of life sort of story. But yet it's at the turn of the century, and our main character, Adam Trask, has found himself into a boatload of money. While his father was abusive, he left him everything. And it's just kind of crazy to just kind of see him living in his daily life, talking to his Chinese manservant, figuring out how a motor car is supposed to work, as well as just trying to figure out how to raise his two kids after his psycho wife left him to run a brothel. It's weird how it has like a very slow pace, but at the same time, there's a lot of dark elements. Like the psycho wife I mentioned, it's very heavily implied that she killed her parents by burning down the house. It's never really confirmed, but it feels very obvious. Highly recommend. Then this one right here. This is a really important one for me. To Kill a Mockingbird. If you're like me, you probably had to read this at the end of junior high school. And this was probably the first book I ever read for school that I legitimately enjoyed. In fact, you only had to complete so many chapters by the time the next class happened, and there was just a few times I just like, screw that, I want to know what happens next. And I just keep it around because I have a feeling I want to read it again to see if it's just as good as it was before. And I do like the idea that this one has a slightly different cover. Whenever I read it in school or whenever I see it somewhere else, it's usually the picture of the tree that Boo Radley would be leaving all his stuff in. However, here, you can actually see what looks like a mockingbird being killed. Which, well, I'm not sure if it's very deep, but I think the main reason it's called To Kill a Mockingbird, as well as why this imagery is so striking, is because it's all about the death of... having a blank as to what his name was, but the death of Atticus's client... I am just blanking. How can I remember Atticus Finch and Boo Radley, but I can't remember the name of the guy who was sent up the river? But anyway, I'm pretty sure that was the thing, because they killed something innocent, and To Kill a Mockingbird is known as a horrible sin, because all they ever do is just create lovely music. This next one I'm saving for a very special occasion. Les Miserables, which I am pretty sure actually dwarfs Atlas Shrugged, surprisingly. I mean, look at this thing. This book is gigantic. In fact, there are actually different versions you can get, where instead of having a giant brick like this, it's actually two smaller bricks. I'm sure this is going to take me quite a long time, because it took me 3 months to get through Atlas Shrugged. I figure this is maybe going to take me like half a year. But I am saving it for when I need something to use up my time with. The next one is another one I add to my Criterion collection of one of my favorite books. So in terms of the James Bond books, I put Moonraker in this collection as well. And I'm also going to throw The Lord of the Rings in there as well, because those were just books I devoured. And this is another one. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Once again, by Signet. You can see that I really like Signet. I feel like they mastered the idea of less is more. The idea that the colors are done very deliberately. The idea that there's just this little picture here that kind of says it all. And hey, you also got all these little miniature reviews on the front. Something a little daring, as that's usually something that's saved for the back. But in general, this is one fantastic book. And what I think makes it fantastic is the narrative style. I have yet to have seen the idea of an untrustworthy narrator. I like how it says right at the beginning, the narrator is at an insane asylum, and it's very possible that he just hallucinated this whole thing. Or it could be entirely possible that maybe some of it happened and some of it was fake. So it's kind of left up to you to wonder, so what was real and what wasn't? Was this guy ever in an insane asylum to begin with? And I think that is absolutely fantastic. It gives the book a lot more depth. And if there's any other stories you can think of that have an untrustworthy narrator like that, I'd be very curious. Because I highly doubt Ken Casey's other work, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, I don't think probably has the same impact as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This one is a bit of an oddity. So, back in the 1970s, they didn't really have VHS or any other form of home media just yet. So the next best thing you had was the novelization. And it's really quite fascinating now knowing some of the deleted scenes from the original New Hope, because they are still left here in the book. And plus you get a fair bit more context. Like, one of the big examples I think of is one of the characters that was part of the Death Star run, nicknamed Poppy, who by all accounts should have died years ago because he wears probably the most blaster-ridden, destroyed helmet and uniform possible, but yet he has been through it all and has thus been able to advise most of the rebellion as to how to be able to deal with most of this stuff. It's very annoying that he's only really on screen for like 15 seconds, and it just gives context as to why he's not wearing his chin strap like all the other ones. Quite frankly, I feel like that could make another fun Star Wars movie. Let's have Poppy, the Star Wars story. I feel like that could be very interesting. And then in the similar vein, I've got The Return of the Jedi. I am still waiting to get The Empire Strikes Back before I actually read this. So the next shelf, for the most part, is just one of two things. The first of those things is comic books. Or at least, I guess that's how you would describe it. But I figured there's a few fun things to note. So, this was by Fawcett Crescent, but it seems very much like a signet book in the idea of like the simple cover as well as the blood-soaked pages. But what's rather interesting is the particular drawing style. They look pretty different compared to some of the other ones. In fact, take a look at Snoopy. Would you even know that's Snoopy? But I guess that's how the character first came out, and it's just kind of interesting to see the evolution of it as it went through. And yeah, I'm just going to go through these kind of quickly because it's mostly just the covers. What's rather fascinating is I guess they didn't really figure out what Charlie Brown's color scheme was, so they gave him a red shirt instead of his trademark yellow. Of course, they would have made the rest of the book red, the shirt yellow, and even the pages red. In fact, even when you look at the back, it's kind of interesting to see these off-color schemes. And then some of these are a little newer. Sometimes there's a little bit of overlap. And what I find rather fascinating is that there's little stories here that were kind of made into specials or were somehow sequels of specials. Like, for instance, a lot of people talk about the famous Great Pumpkin. Well, in one of these collections, Linus actually gets a disciple in Peppermint Patty, where she tries her best to believe in the Great Pumpkin and is sitting out there in the pumpkin patch right with Linus. And I love how everybody even refers to Peppermint Patty as being the disciple. And I just find that very interesting, because it's a rather religious term. And probably one of the other fun things to mention is, at the end of this one, there is actually a little bit of an advertisement, so if you want to get peanuts-related things. I highly doubt these things still exist anymore. Like, I'm gonna guess you can still buy them, probably like off of eBay, but if you were to actually send in the coupon code and then mark the post of postage or whatever, they would probably have no idea what you are talking about. Now this is one I like to show to people because, quite frankly, I never heard of it until I found it. The Wizard of Id. This particular collection is known as There Is a Fly in My Swill. Now if you heard of early man, you might notice that the names of the authors sound very familiar, because that's what they worked on as well. In fact, even The Prisoner seems very similar to that. And while the humor can be a little dry, I think this is good. I kind of wish this one was able to get a little more acknowledgement. But yet for now, I feel like it's mostly just faded into obscurity. And then the other big one I'm a fan of is The Far Side. I actually have quite a few collections of The Far Side, which I will show on the next shelf. But this is the one that I'm currently reading through. I just like to read a little bit before I go to bed, and it's just kind of fun how Gary Larson kind of goes through some of these cartoons, telling the history, the controversy, as well as some of the other fun little things along the way. And then another comic. If people talk about the great debate between Heathcliff and Garfield, I'm a Garfield fan. I tried reading a Heathcliff. I was actually able to get one of these comic books, but I just couldn't get into it. But much like Charlie Brown, here's the thing I find interesting is, take a look at how Garfield looks. That's very different from, well, even how he looks on the cover. It's also interesting to see the evolution of the character. And I like how this is a 3-for-1 deal. You get all 3 collections in one bound book. I picked it up at a garage sale for $5. And then the second thing that shelf has is mini abridgments. I think that's the best way to explain it. So they take like a classic book, they condense it down to be a lot shorter for, it's supposed to be for younger readers, but sometimes it's interesting to just go through the basic details. And they also add little pictures in there as well. I'd be willing to commission somebody to be able to make an Atlas Shrugged version of one of these. Of course, that'd be quite a task to be able to condense a cinder block into a single brick. But I just mostly want to see what the artwork would look like. So, Robinson Crusoe. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Now, this is probably my first time I ever read anything Sherlock Holmes related, and, well, that was back in elementary school. And I still keep it around because if it's something a little short, it's easier to fall asleep to. And then you have Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. So one of these days I gotta read the real version because, wow, this one was fantastic. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Now this one I actually read the quote-unquote real version too. But I just kind of keep this around to just kind of refresh myself with the various events of the story. And, well, certainly a lot faster than reading the actual version. It's a lot bigger than this. And the pictures help keep me on track. Very similar story to the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Now, this is always a fun one because this is a book I have read several times. And I mean both versions, the real one and this one, several times. And yet after each time, I just have a very hard time telling you what happened. The reason for this is unlike the adventures of Tom Sawyer, where it's like one cohesive story, this is just a whole bunch of miniature adventures thrown together. I remember the adventures, and after a recent conversation, I now remember how this book actually ends, but somehow I find it rather forgettable, which is good because I keep wanting to go back to read it again and figure out what it is, but at the same time, if it doesn't stick with me, I feel like something is not being done right. You got The Man in the Iron Mask, which I believe is part of the Three Musketeers series. I'm not really sure which one in particular, but I do know that the Three Musketeers are part of it. And it is also interesting that The Man in the Iron Mask was based off of an actual prisoner. And this was just kind of a fan fiction as to what the prisoner did to make it so his face had to be concealed at all times. You got Portrayal on the HMS Bounty. It's interesting how this one's considered a classic, even though it's really more of an autobiographical work explaining, okay, so this is what happened from the captain's perspective. This is a really dark one, and I found it rather interesting that Oliver and Company was kind of a twist on this. It took me so many years to realize the announcer was just like, it's the classic story of Oliver with a little twist. Huh. Oliver, twist. But probably the thing I find the most interesting is that Fagin is actually the bad guy in the original story. And Mr. Sykes, yeah, he's kind of the evil banker, but Fagin, wow, he actually is really bad. And the Dodger is really about the same age as Oliver Twist. He's like, I don't know, 8, 10 maybe. And yeah, I mean, it's a good story, but better make sure you're emotionally prepared. It is a rough one. You get the Count of Monte Cristo. You know, I just realized that this one is written by the same author as Man in the Iron Mask. Alexandre Dumas. At least I'm assuming that's how you're supposed to pronounce his name. He's French. The classic story of revenge. I've yet to actually read the quote-unquote real version of this, and maybe I will, but, well, let's just say there was one time I was reading this book and I actually wanted revenge, so instead of helping me get to sleep, it actually kept me up. And the one I very much regret reading the full version of is Moby Dick. If you're going to read this book, if you want to know what the story is all about, do yourself a huge favor and read the abridgment, the actual book. The best way to explain the actual book, okay, this much of it is story. This much of it is useless whale facts. You see how much difference there is to it. You want the story, read the story. And on top of that, you get some awesome pictures. For the most part, this next area is just full of a bunch of miscellaneous stuff. So I figured I would start with this one, Red Wall. Now, in a ways, this story is rather infamous for me, because growing up, I didn't really have a whole lot of stations. In fact, PBS was basically my main source of entertainment. And for a section of time, they kept trying to reintroduce an animated miniseries that kept getting rid of a favorite show that I rather enjoyed watching, in favor of The Red Wall. Well, I figured it was worth a shot. It's like, was I right to hate on it so much, or was it actually pretty good? And after reading the book, I can kind of say, it's okay. It's no furry Lord of the Rings like I was hoping for on the cover, but it was pretty good. The only real problem is I don't really have much of a desire to read this again, but in a ways, I'm kind of stuck with it. Ordinarily, I would just donate it like other books I lost, but, well, this one was signed by the author, so I feel like I gotta get at least some amount of money out of this. I mean, hey, if I got like $5 out of it, I'd be happy. I probably didn't even pay $1 for it. But all the same, very interesting, but I feel like it's more aimed at young adults. All the same, it was pretty good, and it's interesting to see that there is a whole series based off of this. But after this first entry, I'm just not really all that curious to see how the rest of the story continued. Felt like it was kind of a self-contained volume anyway, and I have a feeling that was probably his intention. Up next, well, we'll see where this goes. So, I am what I think is referred to as a Pooh-ophile, which is what one of the Sherman brothers referred to big fans of Winnie the Pooh in a behind-the-scenes interview. And as such, I own the entire collection, and it was a pretty good buy. I mean, here's how much I paid for it, and here's how much it would have been if I bought it brand new. I saved quite a lot of money there, wouldn't you say? Now, what's rather fascinating is there's only really 2 here that are based on the story of Winnie the Pooh, and the other 2 is really just a collection of poems. In fact, I think Winnie the Pooh was briefly introduced in one of the poems, which later led to the inspiration and so on. And, well, these are short little bedtime stories, and I find these are good things to help me get to sleep at night. There's actually quite a few adventures in the Winnie the Pooh books that haven't really made it into the original run of the Disney version. And probably one of my main introductions to the character was the series known as The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. And as far as I know, the adventures described in those didn't really make it there either. But what they did instead was a lot more interesting. The only other thing to note about this, and I find it kind of sad almost, so the author, A.A.L. Milne, his son was named Christopher Robin. Now, probably up until about the age of 7, he was like the hero of the schoolyard. But once he started getting into the teenage years, you don't want to be associated with the one kid that goes on these lands of make-believe with a stuffed bear. So it kind of got to a point where he had a rather bitter breakup with his father and even legally changed his name just to get away from all the embarrassment. It's kind of bittersweet, but at the same time, it did inspire quite a nice volume of books. I'm not too big a fan of the poems that are in between, but I do like the Winnie the Pooh stories. Oh, and I forgot to show the back of the spine. And it's kind of crazy, as you go through here, you get to see the shepherd drawings, and honestly, they recreated them really well in that first batch of the Disney movie. This one was just kind of one of those things I wanted to add to my collection. How to win at Nintendo. Now, being the Giga Stacy that I am, I don't really need this for the good majority of the games I've played. Ha ha ha. But it's also kind of interesting to just kind of see what their interpretation was to being able to beat ghosts and goblins, because it took me about 50 tries, and I was just curious to see if there was anything that was a bit quicker. But like a lot of the other old games, it's all about memorization. But what makes that difficult is that Ghosts and Goblins likes to throw off the pattern a fair bit, so even memorization doesn't help. But it's still an interesting thing to own. And I do kind of wonder, so this Jeff Brown that wrote this book, did he just kind of compile all the classified sections of Nintendo Power to write this? Or was he just a naturally skilled Nintendo player, and instead of everybody going to him directly for advice, he just wrote down his findings in this book? And in fact, I think there are actually other volumes to this, but this is the only one I have. It's more of a collector piece than anything else. Up next, we got Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. I did my review of this one already, but I figured it'd be interesting to just show what the hardcover looks like. And one of the fun things I'm just kind of noticing is it's interesting that Chitty Chitty Bang Bang was green, very much like James Bond's personal Bentley of the books. So it's interesting that there's a little bit of overlap. And still kind of crazy that Ian Fleming wanted to write a children's book. Kind of a pity he didn't really get to see this come to fruition either, because this was written at about the same time as The Man with the Golden Gun, and by that point Ian's health had just dropped dramatically. And once again, I don't think he ever got to see this published. And now, before I mentioned my Far Side book, well, I've actually got quite a few of them. You got Unnatural Selection, which is kind of a fun little compilation. But in between, you got like fun little splash panels of like evolutionary pictures. And I just love the expression of this guy. I feel like whenever there's like a big group picture, I just want to have the enthusiasm of this guy. Just kind of doing a photobomb, but he's so happy. It's like nobody cares. And then after that, it's just a whole bunch of mini collections. I want to say there was like 16 of these in total, but these are the ones I know. So it came from the Far Side. They all kind of have Far Side in their name, actually. In Search of the Far Side, I'm pretty sure this... Oh, it says on the back, this was the third one. The Far Side Observer, this was the 8th one. And then this one is the 10th, Wildlife Preserves. Which, in fact, this is just a colorized and much bigger version of one of his more famous comics. Now on to a rather unique one. So, The Golden Compass. And as it says right up here in the corner, a major motion picture, holiday of 2007. Unfortunately, it never really took off. So there are 3 books in the series. So you got The Golden Compass, The Subtle Knife, and The Amber Spyglass. However, The Golden Compass just didn't really do all that well in theaters, and it just kind of faded into obscurity. However, it's nice to hear that the series is making a bit of a comeback in a new Netflix special. But here are the few things I find interesting. So, 2007, Daniel Craig was actually in The Golden Compass, and I guess it was just right off of the heels of the success of Casino Royale. And I kind of wonder if maybe they were trying to feed off of that by hiring him as an actor, or perhaps he just embodied one of the characters better than anyone else they could find. But here is the thing I find weird, is that whenever people refer to the series, they always refer to it as The Golden Compass, when the entire series is called His Dark Materials, which there are 3 books in total. And you may remember that I was talking about how when you get all 3 of the Lord of the Rings books, they all come together in the form of a picture. Well, very similar thing here, except there's actually a bit of a fun story. So this was the version that I read. I don't know how we got it. Somebody either donated it to us or gave it to us or something, and this is the one I started on. And then, not too long afterwards, I was able to find the second book, The Subtle Knife. However, the main difference is it was not this particular edition. In fact, this particular edition, it took, I don't know, maybe like 4 years after reading this in order to find this particular edition. And then, the third book, The Amber Spyglass. This one I've been looking for forever. In fact, I only just found it 2 months ago. But here is the fun part. You stick them all together, and you see it has a picture. If you look really closely, it shows the title of the book, His Dark Materials. It took me several years to finally be able to get all these together. So I'm going to shed a little bit of light on these books. So I'll just give a basic review. It's been years since I last read this, so it's just going to be very vague. So The Golden Compass, I remember being very well done. It's a very good introduction to the first of the 3 acts. Introduces a lot of interesting concepts of this particular world, but it's not really too boring either. And I feel like it kind of ended on a kind of conclusive note, enough that it was very obvious that there'd be more, but not so much that you'd be like, you're making me wait 5 years for the next entry, or however long it took Philip Pullman to write these. The second one, I almost kind of compare a little bit to The Empire Strikes Back. Now I know it seems like everybody wants to compare it to The Empire Strikes Back, but this one is really dark. So, while the first one was centered on the character that was a girl in this other universe, this one is centered upon a boy that lives in our universe. However, after a freak accident, he ends up killing a man as he tries to assault his house, and he has to run away on the street. And then he somehow crosses over into the same universe as the girl from the first book. And I can't help thinking, like, in that universe, in addition to being a person, you also have, like, a little spirit animal as well that follows you around. It's known as a daemon. And I remember that because it was never really alive in his world, they had to go to the world of the dead in order for them to find it. And it was just freaky. The idea that death is a person, actually. And it's someone that always follows you around, but for the most part remains silent because he knows he's scary. But when the time comes, he's actually a very gentle guide to lead you across the river Styx or whatever the equivalent is. And I just remember this one going really into the dark elements, which were just kind of tickled upon in the first one. The third one, if I remember, there is this one doctor character that somehow finds themselves in a completely other universe. And this one was just really, really abstract. And from what I remember, at the end of the book, I guess the two worlds were separating between the boy and the girl, and unfortunately they had to go back into their own worlds and be able to live their own lives. But before they left, they made one last agreement, that they'd always meet at a particular spot and imagine being able to talk to each other. Which it's kind of a bittersweet ending, but really good. So yeah, if you get the chance, highly recommend. And now on to the final section of my collection. So, this is mostly manga, as well as a few comic books that I have around. I was very interested when I heard that Gnostica of the Valley of the Winds was a manga. Now here is the crazy thing. So you see this Roman numeral 1? Well, in total, there are 7. And for those wondering, so the movie itself of the same name is roughly the first 3. And if you were somehow watching The Warrior of the Winds, well, it's even less than that, actually. But it's really interesting because there is just a lot of detail in here. A lot of very interesting and crazy world building. So, it just kind of makes me think of The Lord of the Rings and the idea that there's like maps. In fact, just look at this artistry. It's fantastic. A lot of people say that apparently Miyazaki practically went insane after finishing these. And I can see why. Not only was it a very ambitious story, but I could not imagine it is something that would be very quick to draw. I mean, it's very distinctly his style, and this must have just taken forever. And on top of that, you gotta invent the story as you're going along. And if I remember correctly, this is the one that... Okay, this one is another poster, kind of showing different tribes and different lands and stuff like that. It is just insane as to how much story there is here. It's definitely something that I like to recommend, but it is quite a journey. In fact, at one point, I was rather tempted to try to make a little bit of a comparison video, kind of saying like how the manga and the movies differs, but seeing that it's really just the first 3, and then having to summarize this much more with 7 definitely being the thickest. It would take forever. But I figure I'll just kind of show what the rest of the covers look like. And on the inside, there's always a little something different. Here you're gonna get to see like the various origins of the toxic jungle. And it's always interesting on the other side, you just have like these lovely watercolor pictures. And I think probably one of the other big things that makes this series so extensive is, so there's basically only 3 factions that are described in the movie. In the book, there are actually 4. There's another one that is a bit more of a religious type. Another one that basically just learned to live within the toxic jungle. And then I cannot think there was another that just wasn't affected by the toxins at all, but still ended up being able to live with everything. Maybe it's just me, but there's something about this picture that just makes me think of Metroid. But yeah, it's quite a commitment, but if you ever have the time, it is something that you will not regret. Well, maybe a little bit, like, maybe this is just the plight of very long and epic stories, but it feels like Miyazaki just kind of went, nope, that's it. We're just going to end it there. Like, it felt like maybe there was a few more pages that needed to be explained, because it just feels like the ending is so abrupt. Then again, I can say the same about The Lord of the Rings, where it basically just ends with Sam going back home saying, well, I'm back. Very similar thing with the end of the 3.5-hour epic of the 10 Commandments, where basically Moses just says, I'm going to go off into this corner and die. Joshua, you're in charge. The end. I feel like Lawrence of Arabia got kind of close to having a halfway decent ending, in the idea that it ends with Lawrence basically hearing that, yes, you did your country a fantastic favor. But unfortunately, these people will probably never see that. And so it just kind of ends there. But at the same time, the beginning kind of starts with the end. So it just feels a lot more palatable than some other epic stories. And now, this is probably one of the craziest comic books that I own. Well, really one of the only ones I own. Archie meets the Punisher. Now, I remember looking this up to kind of see if there was sequels, because it was kind of hinted at that there was a sequel, but didn't really see a whole lot afterwards. But all I'm going to say is, if you think this team up is crazy, apparently there is another one where it's Archie meets the Predator. And that one I find even more crazy. It's the idea that you have like one of the most violent comic book characters to one of the most easygoing comic book characters meeting together. But yet somehow it works really well, actually. This one I kind of forgot that I even had, so it's a comic book of James Bond. I haven't even read this one, actually. I'm liking it so far. Now, this is a very interesting one. This book my grandmother gave to me. I honestly have no idea where she got it. But this is kind of what introduced me to my thirst of knowledge. There's just a lot of very odd and interesting questions brought up here that got their own answer. In fact, I remember, just for fun, there was a video I did on featuring this book, and the idea as to why blue is considered such a masculine color and pink is considered such a feminine color. This book offered a different theory for that. And there's just a lot of other interesting facts in there as well. And then last, but certainly not least, the bride was a boy. So I've already reviewed this one, but as you could probably tell, being trans myself, I like hearing about other people's stories, and, well, it's nice to be able to get a wholesome one, because, well, if I were to make a manga of one of these, I think after about, like, the 10th chapter, a lot of people would have just stopped because it was just so dark and depressing. But if they kept through to the end, they would find that it turned out to be a much happier ending. I guess this is almost kind of like Disney, while my story is almost like Don Bluth. His mentality was always, you can show kids anything, but there has to be a happy ending. And, well, I can very much agree with that. I feel like I have a relatively happy ending, but there was just a lot of hardship to get there, which I was a little jealous of when it comes to Chi, but it's just nice to be able to have a nice, uplifting story, and it's interesting to be able to hear another trans person's story through the art of manga itself. I've seen it through webcomics. I've read 2 autobiographies of it, and this is a manga. So, that is my book collection as of now. Might get a little bigger, but it'll also probably get a little smaller. Basically, I'm the kind of person that only keeps around a book that they intend on either reading again, or that I just like to keep for display purposes. However, for the most part, if I have something in my collection, I'm going to use it. So yeah, this has probably been the longest subscriber special that I've ever done. I hope that you enjoy it, and hey, maybe for my 900 subscriber special, I'll go over my VHS collection. Until next time, keep having fun.